Miss Marple, Tinsel Tea Tragedy. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm Edward. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Festive Gathering. The afternoon light was already fading when Miss Marple stepped through the doorway of the St. Mary Mead Women's Guild Hall, though it was scarcely 3:30. December had that quality about it, she reflected, of making one feel the day was perpetually drawing to a close. Rather like poor Mrs. Henderson's nephew, who had always given the impression of being about to leave a room even when he had only just entered it. He had come to a bad end, as she recalled, though that was neither here nor there. The hall itself was a riot of festive cheer. Red bows adorned every window frame, and garlands of greenery draped the walls with generous abandon. From the ceiling, beams hung strand after strand of silver tinsel that caught the lamplight and threw it back in glittering fragments. Long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, covered with pristine white cloths, and set with the guild's best china, the cups and saucers that only emerge for special occasions, and that bore, most of them, the small signs of long service. A chip here, a hairline crack there. Jane, my dear, there you are at last. Mrs. Bantry swept toward her, resplendent in the green velvet that complemented her ruddy complexion. Dolly Bantry was an old friend, and her enthusiasm for village events was matched only by her complete inability to arrive at them on time. "I've saved you a seat beside me," Mrs. Bantry continued, tucking her arm through Miss Marple's. "Though heaven knows where we'll all fit once the vicar's wife finishes arranging people. She has very decided views about seating, you know. Something to do with not placing Mrs. Harmon near anyone who grows better roses than she does, which rather limits the options." Miss Marple smiled gently as she allowed herself to be led toward the long table. The hall was filling rapidly now, a stream of familiar faces wrapped in winter coats and scarves, bringing with them the cold scent of December air and an atmosphere of determined cheerfulness. Christmas did that to people, Miss Marple had observed. It made them behave as though happiness were a duty to be discharged. "Of course the real excitement," Mrs. Bantry said in a lowered voice, "is whether Evelyn Wyndham will actually appear. She sent word she would, but you know how she is, always making an entrance, as though the rest of us were merely players waiting for the star to arrive." Miss Marple did know. Mrs. Evelyn Wyndham had moved to the village 3 years previously, a widow of independent means and decided opinions. She had what Miss Marple's nephew Raymond would have called a glamour, though Miss Marple herself thought it rather more like varnish, bright and effective on the surface, but one always wondered what lay beneath. "I believe she's bringing something for the auction," Miss Marple ventured. "Oh, she's made quite certain everyone knows about that," Mrs. Bantry replied. "Mysterious hints and significant looks. I expect it's another of her little dramas." They settled into their seats, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the room. The vicar's wife was indeed arranging people with the concentration of a general positioning troops. Mrs. Price, the doctor's widow, was being gently shepherded toward a seat near the tea urns, her thin frame almost disappearing within a heavy black coat that had seen better days. Mrs. Harmon, all lavender water and rigid posture, was protesting her placement near the kitchen door, and there, by the donation box, stood Mrs. Larkin, the guild's cleaner, looking unusually smart in a navy dress that must have been new. "Mrs. Larkin looks well," Miss Marple remarked. "Doesn't she?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of shared intelligence. "There's talk of an engagement. A gentleman from Much Benham owns a hardware shop, very respectable. Of course Martha Larkin deserves some happiness after all these years. Her husband died when she was barely 30, poor thing. Left her with nothing, as I understand it." Miss Marple nodded. She remembered the business. Though it had been many years ago, Mr. Larkin had been one of those men who are eternally cheerful and eternally unreliable, rather like the pump in the village square that worked beautifully except when one actually needed water. A sudden stir at the doorway announced a new arrival. Conversation dipped and then resumed at a slightly higher pitch, the way it does when people are pretending not to be interested in something while being absolutely riveted by it. Mrs. Evelyn Wyndham had arrived. She stood framed in the doorway for just a moment, long enough for the picture to register. Her coat was trimmed with fur at the collar and cuffs. Her dark hair was perfectly waved beneath a small hat with a feather, and in her gloved hands she carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Ladies," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with theatrical precision, "I do apologise for my tardiness. I was detained by the most tedious matter of business." She moved into the room with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome, though Miss Marple noticed that several of the assembled ladies greeted her with smiles that did not quite reach their eyes. Mrs. Wyndham had that effect. She was the sort of person who made one feel slightly diminished, rather like standing next to a mirror that had been angled to catch only one's worst features. "Evelyn, how lovely," the vicar's wife said with determined politeness. "We've saved you a place at the head table." "How thoughtful." Mrs. Wyndham set her parcel down on the side table with deliberate care. "This is for the auction only, I'm afraid. Not to be opened until the appropriate moment. It's rather special." Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Wyndham removed her coat and gloves. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, though she dressed younger. There was something hard about her eyes, Miss Marple thought, even when she smiled. It reminded her of young Clarissa Brent, who had smiled just that way while systematically stealing from the church collection plate. "Tea will be served shortly," the vicar's wife announced, clapping her hands for attention. "And then we'll have our little programme. Mrs. Harmon has prepared readings, and Miss Fletcher will give us a song." A collective suppression of sighs greeted this news. Miss Fletcher's singing voice was legendary in the village, though not for reasons Miss Fletcher herself appreciated. As the ladies settled into their seats, Miss Marple found herself positioned with an excellent view of the room. Mrs. Wyndham had been placed near the centre of the head table, a position she occupied with the air of one receiving homage. To her left sat young Mrs. Lydia Carter, a pretty woman in her 30s who had been widowed the previous year. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Carter's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, and that she was very carefully not looking at Mrs. Wyndham. The tea urns were brought out, sending clouds of fragrant steam into the air. Mrs. Larkin moved quietly among the tables, setting out plates of sandwiches and cakes. Her movements were efficient, but Miss Marple detected a tension in them, a tightness about the shoulders that spoke of nerves. "I see Martha is helping with the serving," Miss Marple said to Mrs. Bantry. "Oh yes, she always does. Very devoted to the guild is Martha. I suppose she's grateful for the work, poor dear, though I believe her circumstances have improved somewhat recently." Mrs. Wyndham's voice cut across the general conversation. "Mrs. Carter, how delightful to see you. I trust you're finding village life agreeable?" Mrs. Carter's face had gone quite pale. "Yes, thank you. It must be so different from London, though I suppose one adjusts." Mrs. Wyndham's smile was bright and sharp. "Your late husband and I were acquainted, you know. Such a pity about the scandal. But then, these things do have a way of coming out." The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop several degrees. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Mrs. Price, seated nearby, busied herself with straightening her napkin, though Miss Marple noticed her eyes were alert and watchful. The vicar's wife, sensing tension, hurried to intervene. "Now then, shall we pour? The tea is perfectly brewed, I'm assured." As cups were filled and passed, Miss Marple observed the small rituals of the gathering. The careful placement of cups, the murmured thank yous, the slight jostling as people reached for sugar and milk. Mrs. Wyndham received her tea with a proprietary air, setting it down before her with a little flourish. "I must say," she announced to no one in particular, "there's nothing quite like Christmas in an English village. All the old traditions, all the old faces, and sometimes, of course, all the old secrets." She laughed. but it was not a comfortable sound. Miss Marple sipped her own tea thoughtfully. The tinsel overhead swayed gently in the draught from the doorway, throwing dancing shadows across the tables. It was, she reflected, very much like the Christmas tea 15 years ago, when Mrs. Trent had made such pointed remarks about the church accounts and had been found quite dead in her cottage the following morning. Natural causes, the doctor had said. But then doctors did not always know everything. The vicar's wife was rising to propose the Christmas toast. The ladies were reaching for their cups, and Mrs. Wyndham, Miss Marple noticed, was smiling in a way that suggested she was very much enjoying some private joke. It was a pity, Miss Marple thought, that private jokes had such a tendency to become public tragedies. Chapter 2. The Fall of Mrs. Wyndham. The vicar's wife remained standing, her teacup raised in a slightly tremulous hand. She was not, Miss Marple reflected, a natural public speaker, but she approached the task with the same determined goodwill she brought to flower arranging and Sunday school. "Ladies," she began, "it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our annual Christmas tea. As we gather here in fellowship and friendship, let us remember those less fortunate, and let us give thanks for the blessings of community and the season of peace." There was a general murmur of approval and the soft rustle of fabric as the assembled ladies prepared to join the toast. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Wyndham had lifted her cup with particular emphasis, holding it rather higher than was strictly necessary, as though she were posing for a photograph. "To Christmas," the vicar's wife concluded, "and to St. Mary Mead." "To Christmas," the room echoed, voices blending in polite unison. Mrs. Wyndham's voice rose above the others. "And to truth," she added with a smile that struck Miss Marple as distinctly unpleasant. "May it always come to light." She raised the cup to her lips. What happened next occurred with the terrible swiftness that characterizes all true catastrophes. One moment Mrs. Wyndham was drinking, her expression one of smug satisfaction. The next, her face contorted in a spasm of shock and pain. The cup fell from her hand, striking the table and rolling onto its side, tea spreading across the white cloth in a dark stain. Mrs. Wyndham clutched at her throat. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged save for a horrible gasping noise. Her chair scraped backward as she half rose, and then, quite suddenly, she collapsed forward, her head striking the table with a dull thud before she slid sideways and crumpled to the floor. For a moment there was absolute silence, the kind of silence that follows when the mind has not yet caught up with what the eyes have witnessed. Then someone screamed and the spell was broken. Ladies surged to their feet. Chairs toppled. Miss Fletcher's voice rose in shrill exclamation. Mrs. Harmon clutched at her chest and had to be supported by her neighbour. The vicar's wife stood frozen, her own cup still raised, her face gone quite white. "Get the doctor," someone shouted. "Quickly, fetch Dr. Haydock." "He's at the surgery," Mrs. Price said, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority. "I'll telephone." She hurried toward the door with remarkable speed for a woman of her years. Miss Marple, who had risen with the others but had not joined the general rush toward the fallen woman, moved quietly to where Mrs. Wyndham had been sitting. Mrs. Bantry was at her elbow immediately. "Jane, this is dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Do you think it's her heart?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said absently. Her eyes were fixed on the table, on the overturned cup and the spreading pool of tea. Something was not quite right. Something beyond the obvious tragedy of a woman falling ill at a Christmas gathering. Several ladies were now kneeling beside Mrs. Wyndham, attempting to loosen her collar and chafing her hands in the time-honoured fashion of those who must do something, however futile. Mrs. Larkin had produced a cushion from somewhere and was attempting to place it beneath the fallen woman's head, though her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were shaking badly. "Give her air," Mrs. Bantry commanded, taking charge with the efficiency born of years of village committees. "Stand back, everyone. Let her breathe." But Miss Marple, observing Mrs. Wyndham's still form and the peculiar bluish tinge to her lips, rather thought that breathing was no longer a possibility. Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt considerably longer. He was a brisk, competent man in his 50s, not given to unnecessary sentiment. He shouldered his way through the cluster of ladies and knelt beside Mrs. Wyndham, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked for pulse, for breath, for any sign of life. After a moment, he sat back on his heels. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said quietly. "She's gone." The words fell into a well of shocked silence. Someone began to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs that spoke more of nerves than grief. Mrs. Harmon swayed and had to be guided to a chair. The vicar's wife clutched at a table edge as though it were the only solid thing in a suddenly unstable world. "But how?" she managed. "How can she be dead? She was perfectly well a moment ago." "That I cannot say without examination." Dr. Haydock stood, brushing at his knees. "But the symptoms suggest some form of seizure, possibly cardiac in nature." He paused, his professional manner faltering slightly. "It was very sudden." "Too sudden," Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Haydock's head turned sharply. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple." "I said it was very sudden, Doctor. Remarkably so." Their eyes met, and in that moment Miss Marple saw recognition dawn in the doctor's face. He was no fool to Haydock. He understood what she was suggesting. "I think," he said carefully, "that the police should be notified. As a precaution, you understand. In cases of sudden death, it's merely procedure." "Of course, the vicar's wife said faintly. "Whatever you think best." As Dr. Haydock moved toward the telephone, Miss Marple returned her attention to the table. The other ladies were occupied with shock and speculation, their voices rising in a confused babble of distress. No one was watching as Miss Marple bent slightly, her sharp old eyes examining the cup that had fallen from Mrs. Wyndham's hand. It lay on its side, a small pool of tea still visible within. The handle faced toward her, and Miss Marple observed it with particular interest. Or rather, she observed what was not there. The cup bore no chip, no flaw, no mark of any kind. It was, in fact, in perfect condition. Her gaze moved to the other cups on the table, the ones from which the ladies had been drinking. Every single one showed some sign of wear. A tiny chip near the rim here, a hairline crack in the glaze there. The gild's china had been in service for many years, and time had left its mark. But Mrs. Wyndham's cup was pristine. Miss Marple glanced toward the back of the hall where the tea urns stood on their table alongside stacks of spare cups and saucers. Those would be the newer additions, she surmised, brought out when the regular service proved insufficient for larger gatherings. She looked again at the place where Mrs. Wyndham had been sitting. The saucer remained on the table, and Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. There, caught against the rim of the saucer, was a small red fragment. She touched it with one finger, brought it closer to her nose, and detected a faint, bitter scent. Holly berry. Or more precisely, crushed holly berry. "Jane, you look very pale." Mrs. Bantry had returned, her face creased with concern. "This has been a terrible shock for all of us. Perhaps we should go outside for a moment, get some air." "In a moment, Dolly." Miss Marple straightened, her mind working rapidly. "Tell me, did you happen to notice Mrs. Wyndham's cup before the toast?" "Her cup?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Well, no, not particularly. Why on earth would I notice her cup?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "I rather think it was not her cup at all." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the cup from which Mrs. Wyndham drank was not the cup that was originally placed before her. Someone exchanged them." The words hung in the air between them, their implication too terrible to be immediately grasped. Mrs. Bantry's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. "But Jane, that would mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I'm afraid it would." She looked around the hall at the tinsel glittering overhead, at the festive decorations that now seemed almost mocking in their cheerfulness. Somewhere in this room was someone who had planned and executed murder. Someone who had known that Mrs. Wyndham would reach for her cup during the toast. Someone who had prepared a deadly substitute and made the exchange at precisely the right moment. Someone who had used the very spirit of Christmas as cover for killing. Mrs. Larkin was weeping quietly near the kitchen door, her face buried in her hands. Mrs. Carter sat very still, her expression blank with shock. Mrs. Price had returned from making the telephone call and was speaking in low tones with the vicar's wife. And over by the window, Miss Fletcher was fanning herself with her handkerchief, looking as though she might faint at any moment. Any one of them might be guilty, or none of them. In Miss Marple's long experience, murderers were not always obvious. Indeed, they were usually the last person one would suspect, which was precisely why they got away with it for as long as they did. But they did not generally get away with it when Miss Marple was present. She moved to where de Haydock stood guard over the body, preventing anyone from coming too close. The police, he had been assured, were on their way from Much Benham. "Doctor," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think you should examine the contents of that cup very carefully, and you might also wish to preserve the saucer. There appears to be some residue that may prove significant." Dr. Haydock looked at her sharply, then at the cup, then back at her face. "I see," he said slowly. "Yes, I shall do exactly that." Outside, the December afternoon was drawing toward evening, and the light was fading fast. Inside the hall, beneath the cheerful tinsel and the Christmas garlands, a woman lay dead, and the season of peace had been shattered by the oldest and darkest of human crimes. Miss Marple returned to her seat and folded her hands in her lap. There was nothing to do now but wait for the police and observe and remember, because somewhere in the events of this afternoon lay the answer, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 3. The Cup in the Wrong Place. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham in a state of barely suppressed irritation, which was, Miss Marple had observed over the years, his habitual condition. He was a large man with a florid complexion and a manner that suggested the world was full of people deliberately wasting his time. Behind him came Constable Polk, who was local to St. Mary Mead, and considerably more temperate in disposition. "Now then," Inspector Slack announced, surveying the hall with evident displeasure, "I'm told there's been a death. Sudden death. And Dr. Haydock seems to think there's something irregular about it." "I said it warranted investigation," de Haydock corrected mildly. "The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, though I cannot be certain without proper examination." Poisoning. Inspector Slack repeated the word as though it were personally offensive. "At a church tea? Really, Doctor, isn't that rather melodramatic?" "Nevertheless," de Haydock said with the patience of one accustomed to official scepticism, "I recommend you treat this as suspicious until proven otherwise." Inspector Slack grunted and moved to where Mrs. Wyndham's body lay, now covered with a tablecloth that someone had thought to provide. He stood looking down at it for a moment, then turned his attention to the assembled ladies, who'd been requested to remain in the hall. "Right then, I'll need statements from everyone. Constable Polk, you'll take names and addresses, and nobody leaves until I say so." A collective murmur of dismay greeted this pronouncement, but Inspector Slack appeared unmoved. He was scanning the room with the expression of a man expecting trouble and determined to find it before it found him. Miss Marple, who had returned to her seat beside Mrs. Bantry, sat very quietly and observed. She had learned long ago that the police did not appreciate unsolicited assistance, particularly from the elderly ladies. Inspector Slack, in particular, had made his views on amateur detection quite clear during the unpleasantness involving Colonel Prothero. It was better, therefore, to watch and listen and draw one's own conclusions. "Now then," Inspector Slack was saying to the vicar's wife, "you were in charge of this affair. Who had access to the tea things?" "Access?" The vicar's wife fluttered her hands helplessly. "Why, everyone, I suppose. The cups were laid out on the tables before the guests arrived. Mrs. Larkin helped with the arrangements." "Mrs. Larkin?" Inspector Slack's gaze fixed on the cleaner, who shrank back against the wall. "That would be you, I take it?" "Yes, sir." Mrs. Larkin's voice was barely audible. "I set out the cups and saucers and helped with the tea urns." And the deceased Mrs. Wyndham. Did you know her well? A pause, just fractionally too long. Not well, sir. No. Miss Marple filed this away for future consideration. Not well, Mrs. Larkin had said, but her tone had suggested something more complicated than simple acquaintance. Inspector Slack moved on to questioning others, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to rise and move quietly toward the tea table. Dr. Haydock had preserved the cup and saucer, placing them carefully on a side table away from the general confusion. Miss Marple approached as though merely stretching her legs, her movements casual and unhurried. The cup sat precisely where the doctor had left it. In the lamplight, Miss Marple could see more clearly now what she had suspected earlier. The glaze was perfect, unmarred by the small accidents of daily use. She bent closer, ostensibly to adjust the tinsel on a nearby decoration, and examined the saucer more carefully. The red fragment she had noticed earlier was still there, caught against the rim. But there was something else as well, a faint residue, slightly sticky to the touch when she brushed it with one careful finger. She brought her hand to her nose and detected the same bitter scent, but beneath it something else, something sweet and cloying. Hollyberries were poisonous, certainly, particularly in concentration, but they worked slowly, causing gastric distress before more serious symptoms developed. Mrs. Wyndham had collapsed almost instantly, which meant either the dose had been extraordinarily large, or there had been something else in the cup, something more immediately lethal. Miss Marple, she turned to find a Haydock at her elbow, his expression knowing. Examining the evidence, I see. Merely observing, Doctor. Miss Marple's tone was mild. It's a habit of age, I'm afraid. One notices details. And what details have you noticed? Miss Marple glanced toward Inspector Slack, who was occupied with questioning Mrs. Harmon about the seating arrangements. She lowered her voice. The cup is from the reserve stock, not from the table setting. Someone brought it from the back counter where the spare china is kept, and the residue on the saucer suggests crushed holly berries, but I suspect they were merely meant to disguise something more potent. Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose. You have a remarkably analytical mind for a village lady. I merely remember similar incidents, Miss Marple said. There was a case in my youth involving a garden party and some unfortunate business with foxglove. The symptoms were remarkably similar. Digitalis poisoning, the doctor called it. Very rapid, very effective. Digitalis. Dr. Haydock considered this. Yes, that would fit the symptoms. Cardiac arrest, sudden collapse. And foxglove grows wild in these parts. Indeed it does. Though one would need to know how to extract and concentrate the poison, it's not something anyone could do by accident. They stood in silence for a moment, the implications settling between them like snow. This had been planned, carefully and deliberately. Someone had prepared a poisoned cup, brought it from the back counter, and substituted it for Mrs. Wyndham's original cup at precisely the right moment. But when had the exchange occurred, and who had been close enough to manage it? Miss Marple's mind returned to the moments before the toast. She had been watching the room, as was her habit. The vicar's wife had been standing, preparing to speak. The ladies had been settling into their seats, reaching for their cups, and Mrs. Wyndham had been sitting at the head table, her cup before her. Or had it been before her? Miss Marple closed her eyes, visualizing the scene. Mrs. Wyndham had arrived late, made her dramatic entrance, set down her mysterious parcel. She had removed her coat and gloves and taken her seat. The tea had already been poured. Her cup had been waiting, but then there had been that moment of general movement as people adjusted chairs and passed sugar and milk. A moment when everyone's attention had been divided, when the table had been briefly obscured by reaching arms and turning bodies. A moment when a cup could have been exchanged for another. Miss Marple opened her eyes and looked around the hall. Mrs. Carter was sitting very still, her hands clenched in her lap. Mrs. Price was speaking quietly with Constable Polk, her manner composed despite the circumstances. Mrs. Larkin had moved to stand near the kitchen door, as though ready to flee at the first opportunity, and Mrs. Bantry was watching Inspector Slack with the expression of one observing a particularly unintelligent breed of dog. Any one of them could have made the exchange, or rather, any one of them who had been close enough to the head table during that crucial moment of confusion. Miss Marple moved quietly back toward her seat, but her path took her past the table where the spare cups were kept. As she had suspected, these were in better condition than the ones that had been laid out for tea. They were reserves, brought out only when numbers demanded, and consequently less worn. She counted them. 6 cups remained, which meant that 7 had been taken for use. But the head table had seated only 6 ladies, and Mrs. Wyndham had made 7. Someone had needed us an extra cup. Someone had taken it from this very stack, and someone had used it to commit murder. Miss Marple, Inspector Slack's voice cut across her thoughts. A word, if you please. She turned to find him bearing down on her, with the determined expression of a man who has decided to address a problem head-on. Now then, he said, I understand from Dr. Haydock that you have some theory about this business. Something about cups being switched. Not a theory, Inspector. An observation. The cup from which Mrs. Wyndham drank is in perfect condition, unlike the others on the table. It must have come from the reserve stock. And why would anyone switch cups? Because, Miss Marple said patiently, the poisoned cup would have been prepared in advance and kept separate until the appropriate moment. One could not poison a cup while it sat on the table in full view, but if one prepared it beforehand and then exchanged it during a moment of confusion, the deed could be accomplished quite safely. Inspector Slack's face had taken on a deeper shade of red. And I suppose you know who did this? Not yet, Inspector. But I believe the answer lies in understanding who had both opportunity and motive. And in this case, I suspect motive is the more revealing of the two. She did not add that she intended to discover both, whether the inspector welcomed her assistance or not. In her experience, the truth had a way of emerging regardless of official sanction, and murder, once committed, left traces that only patience and observation could reveal. Inspector Slack grunted and turned away, already calling for Constable Pork. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind working steadily through the puzzle before her. Someone in this room had killed Mrs. Wyndham. Someone who had planned carefully and acted boldly. Someone who had used Christmas cheer as camouflage for deadly intent. And Miss Marple meant to find out who. Chapter 4, Mrs. Price's Observation. It was nearly an hour before Inspector Slack allowed the ladies to depart, and even then only after extracting promises that they would make themselves available for further questioning. The body had been removed, the hall had been declared off limits pending investigation, and the Christmas tea had ended in a manner that would be discussed in St. Mary Mead for years to come. Miss Marple accepted Mrs. Bantry's offer of a lift in the car, though her cottage was but a short walk from the Guildhall. The evening had turned bitterly cold, and her knees, which were reliable indicators of weather and advancing age, were informing her that snow was likely before morning. Well, Mrs. Bantry said as they settled into the back seat, I never thought to see such a thing at a church function. Poor Evelyn, whatever one thought of her. To die like that and so suddenly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed quietly, though I'm not certain poor is quite the word I would choose. Mrs. Bantry shot her a sharp look. Jane Marple, you're thinking something, I can always tell. What is it? I'm thinking, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mrs. Wyndham was not a universally beloved figure, and I'm thinking that someone disliked her enough to plan her death with considerable care. But who and why? Those, Miss Marple said, are precisely the questions that require answering. The car deposited her at her gate, and Miss Marple made her way up the path to her cottage, her mind still occupied with the events of the afternoon. Once inside, she put the kettle on, for tea was as much a thinking aid as a comfort, and settled into her chair by the window. The facts, as she understood them, were these. Mrs. Wyndham had been poisoned by a substance placed in her teacup, most likely digitalis disguised with crushed hollyberries. The cup had been exchanged during the brief confusion before the toast, substituted for the one that had originally been placed at her setting. The poisoner had acted with knowledge and planning, which suggested both premeditation and familiarity with Mrs. Wyndham's habits. But what of motive? Mrs. Wyndham had made that curious remark about truth coming to light. She had brought a mysterious parcel for the auction, insisting it not be opened prematurely. And she had made that pointed comment to Mrs. Carter about scandals and reputations. Miss Marple was still pondering these elements when her doorbell rang. She rose somewhat stiffly and opened the door to find Mrs. Price standing on the step, her thin face pinched with cold and something that might have been distress. "Miss Marple, I do apologise for calling so late, but I wondered if I might have a word with you. It's rather important." "Of course, Mrs. Price, do come in out of the cold." Miss Marple led her visitor into the sitting room and insisted on providing tea, despite Mrs. Price's protest that she didn't wish to impose. The ritual of pouring and serving gave Miss Marple time to observe her guest. Mrs. Price was nervous, that much was evident. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup, and she kept glancing towards the door as though expecting interruption. "Now then," Miss Marple said gently, once they were settled, "what was it you wished to discuss?" Mrs. Price set down her cup with a small clatter. "It's about this afternoon. About poor Mrs. Wyndham. You see, I saw something before it happened, and I'm not certain whether I ought to tell Inspector Slack, because it might mean nothing at all, but then again it might be important, and I thought you would know what I should do." She had delivered this speech in a single breathless rush, and now sat looking at Miss Marple with an expression of mingled hope and anxiety. "I think," Miss Marple said, "that you had better tell me what you saw. Then we can decide together whether it bears reporting to the police." Mrs. Price nodded and drew a breath. It was before the tea began, while people were still arriving and finding their seats. I had gone to check on the urns to make certain they were hot enough, you understand, and I happened to glance out the window near the kitchen. She paused, and Miss Marple waited patiently. One did not hurry confidences, particularly from someone as naturally reticent as Mrs. Price. "I saw Mrs. Wyndham," Mrs. Price continued. "She was standing outside just by the side entrance, and she was arguing with someone." "Arguing?" "Yes. Well, perhaps arguing is too strong a word. But they were speaking very intently, and Mrs. Wyndham looked angry. Quite flushed she was, and gesturing with her hands." "And with whom was she speaking?" Mrs. Price's hands twisted in her lap. "That's the difficult part, you see. It was Mrs. Carter. Young Mrs. Lydia Carter." Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence. She recalled the tension between the two women at the table, Mrs. Wyndham's pointed remark about scandals and reputations. "Could you hear what they were saying?" "Not clearly, no. The window was closed and they were some distance away, but I could see that Mrs. Carter was distressed. She kept shaking her head, and at one point she put her hand to her face as though she might cry. Then Mrs. Wyndham said something quite sharp, I could tell by her expression, and Mrs. Carter turned and walked away very quickly. And Mrs. Wyndham? She stood there for a moment looking rather satisfied with herself, if you take my meaning. Then she came inside through the side entrance and made that dramatic appearance in the main hall. Miss Marple considered this. The argument had occurred before the tea began, which meant Mrs. Carter had known of Mrs. Wyndham's plans, or at least suspected them, and Mrs. Wyndham, characteristically, had been enjoying the discomfort she caused. Did anyone else witness this exchange? I don't believe so. Most of the ladies were in the main hall. I only saw it because I was in the kitchen. Mrs. Price hesitated. There's something else, Miss Marple, something I'm even less certain about. Yes? After Mrs. Wyndham had gone into the hall, I remained in the kitchen for a few minutes tidying things, and I noticed Mrs. Larkin acting rather strangely. In what way? She kept going to the donation box and looking at it, just staring at it really, with the oddest expression on her face. And at one point she reached out as though she might open it, but then she drew her hand back. She looked quite agitated. The donation box. Miss Marple filed this detail away carefully. Did she say anything? No, not a word, but she jumped quite violently when I spoke to her, as though her thoughts had been miles away. Or perhaps guilty conscience makes one nervous. I don't like to speak ill of anyone, Miss Marple, but Martha Larkin has always seemed to me a woman with secrets." This was a remarkable statement from the usually circumspect Mrs. Price, and Miss Marple regarded her with interest. "What makes you say that?" Mrs. Price coloured slightly. "I shouldn't gossip, but there was always something not quite right about her husband's death. Oh, the doctor said it was his heart, and I've no doubt it was, but there were rumours at the time about debts he had left and questions about money that had gone missing from somewhere. I was living in Much Benham then, but my sister wrote to me about it. The whole thing was hushed up very quickly, as these things often are." "And Mrs. Larkin?" "She sold up everything and took the position at the Guild. Very quiet, very hard-working. But she's always seemed to me like someone waiting for something, or perhaps hiding from something." Mrs. Price shook her head. "I really shouldn't say such things. It's pure speculation on my part." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple said, "observation and speculation are often the first steps towards truth. You were quite right to tell me, Mrs. Price, and I think you should tell Inspector Slack as well, particularly about the argument between Mrs. Wyndham and Mrs. Carter." Mrs. Price looked relieved. "You think it's important, then?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that in cases of murder, everything is potentially important. A chance remark, a momentary expression, a glance exchanged between two people. These are the threads from which the truth is woven." After Mrs. Price had departed, full of thanks and promises to speak with the inspector in the morning, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her chair, watching the darkness gather beyond her window. Snow had begun to fall as her knees had predicted, drifting down in soft, silent flakes that transformed the garden into something strange and beautiful. Mrs. Carter had quarrelled with Mrs. Wyndham shortly before the tea. Mrs. Larkin had been preoccupied with the donation box, and Mrs. Wyndham herself had arrived with that mysterious parcel, making cryptic remarks about truth coming to light. 3 women, each connected to the victim, each with access to the tea table during those crucial moments before the toast, and one of them, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had seized the opportunity to commit murder. But which one? And more importantly, why? The answer, she suspected, lay not in what had been said that afternoon, but in what had been left unsaid, in the glances avoided, the silences maintained, the careful way people had arranged themselves around the uncomfortable truth of Mrs. Wyndham's presence. Murder, in Miss Marple's experience, was rarely a spontaneous act. It grew from long-standing grievances, from wounds that festered in the darkness until they could no longer be borne. Someone had reached that point with Mrs. Wyndham. Someone had decided that death was preferable to whatever revelation the woman had threatened. Miss Marple rose and went to the window, watching the snow fall on St. Mary Mead. Somewhere in the village a murderer was also watching the snow, perhaps believing themselves safe. But safety, Miss Marple knew, was an illusion. The truth had a way of emerging, like spring flowers through winter snow, and she intended to help it along. Chapter 5, The Tinsel Above the Table. The snow continued through the night and into the following morning, transforming St. Mary Mead into a scene that might have graced a Christmas card. Miss Marple, however, was less concerned with picturesque beauty than with practical investigation. After breakfast, she wrapped herself warmly and set out for the Guildhall, where she fully expected to encounter Inspector Slack's inevitable objections. She was not disappointed. "Now see here, Miss Marple," the inspector said, blocking the doorway with his considerable bulk. "This is a crime scene. You can't just wander in as though it were a garden fete." "I have no intention of wandering, Inspector. I merely wish to retrieve my gloves, which I believe I left on the table yesterday. Surely that's permissible?" Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found this explanation less than convincing, but he was saved from responding by the arrival of Constable Polk, who emerged from the hall carrying a notebook. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but we've finished with the initial examination. Dr. Haydock's report confirms digitalis poisoning, concentrated dose, and the lab found traces of crushed holly berries on the saucer, just as Miss Marple suggested." Inspector Slack's face darkened. "Yes, well, that's as may be. Science doesn't need amateur assistants to reach its conclusions. Of course not, Miss Marple said mildly, though I'm glad my poor observations proved accurate. Now, about my gloves. With a grunt of displeasure, Inspector Slack stepped aside. 5 minutes, Miss Marple, and touch nothing. Naturally not, Inspector. She entered the hall, which looked distinctly melancholy in the grey morning light. The festive decorations remained in place, but they seemed tawdry now, false cheer masking recent tragedy. The tables had been left as they were, though Mrs. Wyndham's place had been marked off with rope. Miss Marple moved slowly through the space, ostensibly searching for her gloves, but in reality examining the scene with fresh eyes. In her experience, important details often emerged upon second viewing, things that the mind had registered but not consciously noted during the confusion of initial events. She paused beside the head table, looking down at the place where Mrs. Wyndham had sat. The teacup and saucer had been removed for evidence, but the placement of other items told their own story. The napkin, still folded, suggested Mrs. Wyndham had not begun eating before the toast. The chair, pushed back at an awkward angle, showed the violence of her collapse. Miss Marple's gaze travelled upward, drawn by a glint of light. The tinsel hung overhead, swaying gently in the draught from the ill-fitting windows. It had been arranged in garlands that crisscrossed the ceiling beams, creating a canopy of silver that caught and reflected what little light penetrated the clouds. Something about the tinsel troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what. She studied it more carefully, noting how it had been fastened to the beams with tacks and string. The arrangement was somewhat haphazard, as one would expect from volunteer decorators working with limited time and resources. But there, directly above where Mrs. Wyndham had been sitting, something appeared different. The tinsel hung slightly lower than elsewhere, as though it had been disturbed, and caught between the strands, barely visible against the silver, was a small rectangle of white. Miss Marple glanced toward the doorway. Inspector Slack was in conversation with Constable Polk, their backs to the hall. Without allowing herself to consider the impropriety of what she was about to do, Miss Marple pulled a chair from the table and positioned it beneath the tinsel. Her knees protested as she climbed onto the seat, but she ignored them. Some things were worth a bit of discomfort. She reached up carefully, her fingers brushing through the tinsel until they closed on the white object. It was paper, folded twice to make a small square. She withdrew it, climbed down from the chair with more haste than grace, and tucked the paper into her pocket just as Inspector Slack's voice called out, "Found those gloves yet, Miss Marple?" "Just this moment, Inspector," she replied, producing from her handbag a pair she had brought precisely for this purpose. "They were under my seat, as I thought. How careless of me." Inspector Slack made a non-committal sound. "Right then, off you go. And no more detecting, if you please. Leave that to professionals." Miss Marple smiled her most harmless smile and took her leave. Once outside, she walked briskly back toward her cottage, her hand pressed against her pocket to ensure the paper remained secure. She did not examine it until she was safely home with the door closed behind her. The paper, when unfolded, proved to be a note written in a bold, flowing hand that Miss Marple recognised from various guild notices as belonging to Mrs. Wyndham. The message was brief and pointed. "Meet me at the old mill after the auction. We settle this today." Miss Marple read it 3 times, considering the implications. The old mill was a ruined structure on the edge of the village, abandoned for decades and generally avoided except by adventurous children. It was not a place one visited casually, particularly in winter. The note suggested a planned confrontation, an appointment made for after the Christmas tea and its accompanying auction. But with whom had Mrs. Wyndham planned to meet? And regarding what matter did they need to settle things? More importantly, how had this note come to be hidden in the tinsel above the table? Miss Marple moved to her writing desk and examined the paper more closely. It was good quality stationery, cream-coloured with a faint watermark. The fold mark suggested it had been carried in a pocket or handbag, handled and perhaps read multiple times, But there was something else, a faint smudge near one corner that might have been a thumbprint pressed into the paper by a damp or nervous hand. The note must have fallen from someone's possession during the tea, perhaps knocked loose during the chaos that followed Mrs. Wyndham's collapse. It had drifted upward, caught by the draught, and become entangled in the tinsel where it had remained hidden until Miss Marple's investigation. But whose pocket or handbag had it fallen from? Mrs. Wyndham herself would have had no reason to carry a note she had written. Therefore, it must have been in the possession of the intended recipient. Someone who had received this summons to meet at the old mill, someone who had carried it to the tea, and someone who had inadvertently lost it in the confusion. Miss Marple considered the people who had been present. Mrs. Carter, with her quarrel and her distress over whatever scandal Mrs. Wyndham had threatened to expose. Mrs. Larkin, nervous and preoccupied with the donation box. Mrs. Price, observant and anxious, keeping watch on events with the wariness of someone who knew more than she was saying. Any of them might have received such a note. Any of them might have had reason to meet Mrs. Wyndham privately to settle some matter. And any of them might have decided that murder was a more permanent solution than confrontation. There was also the possibility, Miss Marple reflected, that the intended meeting at the mill had nothing to do with the murder itself. Mrs. Wyndham had struck her as the sort of woman who enjoyed creating drama, who might have arranged multiple confrontations simply for the pleasure of watching people squirm. The note might concern one matter while the murder involved another entirely. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by decades of observing human nature in all its complicated forms, suggested otherwise. The timing was too convenient. Mrs. Wyndham had arrived at the tea with her mysterious parcel, made her pointed remarks about truth coming to light, and planned a private meeting for afterward. It all pointed to a woman who had been orchestrating some grand revelation, who had intended to expose someone's secrets in the most damaging way possible. And someone had decided to stop her before she could do so. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She would need to give it to Inspector Slack, of course, eventually, but first she thought it might be useful to learn more about the old mill and who might have reason to meet there. Constable Polk would know the history of the place, and unlike his superior, he had always been willing to answer a few innocent questions from a curious village lady. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world wrapped in white silence. It was the sort of day that made one think of peace and stillness, of Christmas carols and the warm fires. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the peaceful surface secrets churned like water under ice. Someone in Swindon, Mary Mead, was a murderer, and murderers, in her experience, rarely stopped at one crime if they felt threatened. The note from the Tinsel suggested Mrs. Wyndham had planned to expose something significant enough to warrant a private confrontation, and that confrontation had been prevented by poison in a teacup at a Christmas gathering. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden. Truth, like bulbs beneath the earth, would eventually push its way to the surface. One simply needed patience, observation, and the willingness to see what others preferred to ignore. And Miss Marple had all three in abundance. Chapter 6, The Envelope in the Donation Box. Miss Marple encountered Constable Polk on the High Street that afternoon, making his rounds with the methodical thoroughness that characterised all his duties. He touched his helmet respectfully when he saw her, his round, pleasant face showing none of Inspector Slack's habitual irritation. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Bitter cold, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Constable. Though I must say the snow makes everything rather beautiful, doesn't it? Quite covers up all the untidy bits." Constable Polk nodded his agreement, and Miss Marple, seizing her opportunity, continued in the same casual tone. "I was just thinking about the old mill, actually. I noticed some children heading in that direction yesterday, and I do worry about the safety of the structure. Is it quite sound, do you know?" "The old mill?" Constable Polk's brow furrowed. "Well, it's been derelict these 30 years or more. The roof's mostly gone, and the walls aren't what they were. I wouldn't recommend anyone going there, especially not children. Though young people will do as they please, won't they?" "Quite so. Has anyone reported using it recently? For meetings, perhaps, or storage?" Constable Polk looked at her with the dawning awareness of a man who suspected he was being gently interrogated. "Not that I know of, Miss Marple. Might I ask what prompts your interest?" Miss Marple produced the note from her handbag. "I found this in the hall this morning, Constable. It appears to be in Mrs. Wyndham's handwriting, and I thought it might be relevant to your investigation." Constable Polk read the note, his expression growing serious. "Inspector Slack should see this right away. Where exactly did you find it, if I may ask?" "Caught in the tinsel above the table. It must have fallen from someone's possession during the confusion yesterday." "I see." Constable Polk folded the note carefully. "Thank you, Miss Marple. This is very helpful indeed." After the constable had departed, Miss Marple continued her walk, though her destination was not home, but rather the vicarage. She found the vicar's wife in a state of considerable distress, surrounded by account books and correspondence relating to the guild. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so glad you've come. I'm at my wit's end. Inspector Slack has requested all the guild records, and I'm trying to make sense of our finances. I'm afraid bookkeeping has never been my strong suit." "Perhaps I might help," Miss Marple suggested. "I've some experience with accounts from my time as treasurer for the Mission Society." The vicar's wife accepted this offer with visible relief, and for the next hour they worked through ledgers and receipts, bringing order to chaos. It was during this process that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the donation box itself, which sat on the vicar's desk awaiting return to the hall. "That reminds me," Miss Marple said carefully, "has the donation box been emptied since yesterday?" "Oh, no." Inspector Slack asked that nothing be touched until he'd had a chance to examine everything, though I can't imagine what he expects to find in a donation box. The vicar's wife paused. "Though I suppose he must be thorough, poor Mrs. Wyndham. To think that someone would do such a thing, and at a church function of all years. Indeed. Might I examine the box? Purely out of curiosity, you understand. I promise not to disturb anything." The vicar's wife hesitated, then nodded. "I don't suppose it can hurt, as long as you don't remove anything. The key is here somewhere." She rummaged in her desk drawer and produced a small brass key. Miss Marple took it with murmured thanks and applied it to the lock of the donation box. The lid opened with a creak, revealing the expected collection of coins, a few pound notes, and several raffle tickets that ladies had deposited in lieu of cash. But there was something else as well. Tucked beneath the money, deliberately hidden, was a sealed envelope. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, noting the cream-coloured paper that matched the note she'd found in the tinsel. The envelope was addressed in the same bold handwriting, "Mrs. Evelyn Wyndham." "How odd," the vicar's wife said, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Why would someone put a letter in the donation box?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said slowly, "because they wished to ensure it would not be seen until after the tea had concluded. The box isn't emptied until several days after an event, is it?" "No, usually not until the following week. We count everything together, the committee and I, to ensure accuracy." Miss Marple turned the envelope in her hands. It was sealed, but the flap had been tucked rather than glued, suggesting it could be opened without obvious damage. She looked at the vicar's wife. "I think, my dear, that we should open this. It may be evidence." "But shouldn't we wait for Inspector Slack?" "We could," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect the inspector might be some time in arriving, and this letter may contain information that would help him considerably. We can always say that it came open accidentally. Envelopes do that sometimes, particularly in damp weather." The vicar's wife looked doubtful but did not protest as Miss Marple carefully worked the flap loose. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in neat, precise handwriting quite different from Mrs. Wyndham's flamboyant script. Miss Marple read it through once, then again more slowly. The vicar's wife, reading over her shoulder, gave a small gasp. The letter was brief and devastating in its implications. It detailed a series of charitable donations that Mrs. Wyndham had claimed to have made over the past 5 years, contributions she had frequently mentioned at guild meetings as evidence of her philanthropic nature. The letter provided proof in the form of bank statements and correspondence with charities that these donations had never been sent. Mrs. Wyndham had claimed the tax benefits and the social recognition while keeping the money for herself. "But this is fraud," the vicar's wife breathed. "She lied about everything." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "and someone intended to expose her, today, at the Christmas tea, in front of everyone who mattered to her social standing." "But who wrote it? There's no signature." Miss Marple examined the letter again. The handwriting was educated and careful, the work of someone accustomed to detailed record-keeping. The paper was ordinary, the sort one could purchase at any stationer's, but the information contained in the letter suggested access to financial records and considerable investigative effort. "Someone who knew Mrs. Wyndham's affairs quite well," Miss Marple said. "Someone who had taken the trouble to verify claims and gather evidence. This was not done hastily or in anger. This represents weeks, perhaps months, of careful documentation." She folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. "We must give this to Inspector Slack immediately, but I think it tells us something very important about Mrs. Wyndham's murder." "What's that?" "That she knew exposure was coming. Her remark about truth coming to light, her mysterious parcel for the auction, even her general manner at the tea, all suggest she was aware that someone intended to reveal her secrets, and I suspect she planned to strike first, to control the narrative in some way." The vicar's wife shook her head in bewilderment. "But if she knew someone was after her, surely she would have been more careful. She wouldn't have simply drunk from a cup that might be poisoned." "Ah, but that's precisely the point," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Wyndham struck me as a woman of considerable arrogance. She believed herself clever enough to manage any situation, and arrogance, I'm afraid, is often fatal. She thought of young Timothy Grant, who had been so certain of his own superiority that he had walked directly into the trap set by his business partner. The parallel was instructive. Mrs. Wyndham had underestimated her opponent, had failed to imagine that someone might be desperate enough, or angry enough, to resort to murder. After making arrangements for Inspector Slack to be notified about the letter, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the snow-covered streets. Her mind was working through the implications of what they had discovered. Someone had gathered evidence of Mrs. Wyndham's frauds and planned to expose her publicly. That someone had placed the accusatory letter in the donation box, where it would eventually be found and read aloud during the counting of funds. It was a calculated humiliation designed to destroy Mrs. Wyndham's reputation in the most public way possible. But Mrs. Wyndham had learned of the plan, perhaps had even guessed the identity of her accuser. She had come to the tea prepared for confrontation, with her own revelations to make. The note about meeting at the old mill suggested she had planned a private reckoning first, a chance to threaten or bargain before the public exposure occurred. And someone had decided that murder was preferable to either exposure or confrontation. The question that remained was which crime had motivated the killing. Was the murderer the person who had written the accusatory letter, afraid that Mrs. Wyndham would reveal their own secrets in retaliation? Or was it someone else entirely, someone whose connection to Mrs. Wyndham remained hidden? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Carter and the quarrel Mrs. Price had witnessed. She thought of Mrs. Larkin's nervous preoccupation with the donation box, her agitation suggesting prior knowledge of what it contained. And she thought of Mrs. Price herself, so observant and so quick to report what she had seen, as though directing attention away from her own possible involvement. 3 women, each with potential motive, each with opportunity, and one of them, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had prepared a poisoned cup and executed murder with cold deliberation. The snow began to fall again as evening approached, soft flakes drifting down to cover the tracks that marked the day's activities. But Miss Marple knew that some tracks could not be so easily obscured. Truth, like blood on snow, had a way of showing through. Chapter 7. The Man in the Velvet Coat. The following morning brought news that spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed characteristic of all village intelligence. A stranger had been seen at the Bull and Bear, the local inn, and stranger still, he had been making inquiries about Mrs. Wyndham. Miss Marple learned of this development from her maid, Cherry, who had it from her husband, who had it from the landlord's wife, a chain of communication that Miss Marple had found remarkably reliable over the years. "A gentleman, they say," Cherry reported, as she cleared the breakfast things. "Though from London, so one can't be too sure about that. Wearing a velvet coat, if you can imagine, and asking all sorts of questions about the late Mrs. Wyndham, very particular questions, about where she lived and who her friends were." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "How very interesting. The landlord's wife said he arrived yesterday afternoon just after the snow started. Took a room for 2 nights and hasn't stirred out much except to ask his questions. Inspector Slack went to see him first thing this morning." Miss Marple finished her tea thoughtfully. A stranger from London, arriving the day of the murder, and making inquiries about the victim. It was precisely the sort of development that Inspector Slack would seize upon with relief, preferring an outsider as culprit to the more uncomfortable possibility of a village murderer. But Miss Marple's instincts suggested matters were not so simple. In her experience, murderers rarely advertised their presence by taking rooms at the local inn and asking questions. They preferred to slip away quietly, to distance themselves from the scene of their crime. Nevertheless, she reflected, it would be useful to learn more about this mysterious gentleman. And so, after donning her warmest coat and most sensible boots, Miss Marple set out for the Bull and Bear. The inn was a comfortable establishment that had served the village for 2 centuries, providing accommodation for travellers and gossip for residents in roughly equal measure. Miss Marple found Mrs. Wheaton, the landlord's wife, in the public room, polishing glasses with the preoccupied air of one whose mind is elsewhere. "Miss Marple, good morning. Terrible business about poor Mrs. Wyndham, isn't it? Though I must say I'm not entirely surprised. A woman like that, with her airs and her secrets, was bound to come to a bad end." "You knew her well, then?" "Well enough. She stayed here when she first came to the village, before she took that cottage on the High Street. Very particular about everything, she was. Nothing was quite good enough." Mrs. Wheaton set down her glass with a decisive clink. "Well, you'll be wanting to know about our current guest, I expect, the gentleman in the velvet coat." "If it's not an imposition," Miss Marple said mildly, "I confess to some curiosity. I don't wonder he's been creating quite a stir." Mrs. Wheaton lowered her voice conspiratorially. "His name is Latham, Mr. Percy Latham, and according to what I've overheard, he and Mrs. Wyndham had business dealings some years back." Business dealings. That's what he told Inspector Slack at any rate. Though I got the impression the business hadn't ended well. He seemed quite agitated when he learned she was dead. Not grieved, mind you. Agitated. There's a difference. Miss Marple agreed that there was indeed a difference. "Is Mr. Latham here now?" "He's in the sitting room reading the newspapers. Inspector Slack finished questioning him about an hour ago and told him not to leave the village without permission." Mrs. Wheaton's eyes gleamed with the pleasure of drama, as though he were a suspect. Miss Marple made her way to the sitting room, where she found a man of perhaps 50 seated by the fire. He was, as reported, wearing a velvet coat, rather shabby at the elbows but well cut. His face was lean and intelligent, marked by lines that suggested both humour and hard experience. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, and rose with the automatic courtesy of a gentleman. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Percy Latham. Jane Marple. I live in the village." "Ah." Understanding flickered across his face. "Then you've heard about the tragedy, about Evelyn." "Mrs. Wyndham, yes. It's been most distressing for everyone. You knew her, I understand?" Mr. Latham gestured to a chair and waited for Miss Marple to sit before resuming his own seat. "Knew her? Yes, one might say that. We were business partners once, many years ago, before everything went wrong." There was a bitterness in his voice that suggested old wounds imperfectly healed. Miss Marple said nothing, employing the technique she had found most effective in extracting confidences. Simple, patient silence. "You'll hear it from the police anyway," Mr. Latham continued, "so I might as well tell you myself. Evelyn and I ran an art gallery together in London, back in the 30s. We specialised in modern works, did rather well for a time. Then there was an incident involving a painting that turned out to be a forgery. The buyer sued, there was an investigation, and I was held responsible. But you were innocent. Of deliberate fraud, yes, but ignorant of what Evelyn had done, which the court deemed equally culpable. His mouth twisted. I served 3 years, lost everything, my reputation, my livelihood, my marriage. And Mrs. Wyndham? Evelyn emerged untouched, as she always did, claimed she had been deceived as well, that I must have arranged the forgery without her knowledge. The court believed her. He stared into the fire. She had that gift, you see, the ability to make people believe whatever served her purposes. Yet you came to see her yesterday, Miss Marple observed, after all these years. Mr. Latham's laugh was harsh. I came because I'd learned something. After I was released, I spent years investigating what had really happened with that forgery, and I finally found proof. Documents showing that Evelyn had arranged everything, that she had known exactly what she was doing when she sold that painting. And you intended to confront her with this evidence? I intended to offer her a choice. She could make restitution, provide me with a written confession that would clear my name, or I would take the evidence to the authorities. He met Miss Marple's eyes. I know what you're thinking, that I had motive to kill her, and you're right, I did. I've carried hatred for that woman for more than a decade. But you didn't kill her, Miss Marple said. It was not a question. No, though I won't pretend I'm sorry she's dead. He reached into his coat and withdrew a parcel wrapped in brown paper. This is what I came to show her. The proof of her guilt. I met her outside the Guild Hall yesterday afternoon before the tea. Told her I'd be staying at the inn and that we needed to talk properly. She laughed in my face. Miss Marple recognised the parcel. It was the same size and shape as the one Mrs. Wyndham had carried into the hall, the one she had insisted was for the auction only. She said she'd already prepared for my accusations, Mr. Latham continued. Said she had her own revelations to make, her own scores to settle. She told me to meet her at some old mill after the tea, that we'd settle everything then. But she never came, of course, because by then she was dead. Did she take your parcel? No. She said she didn't need to see it, that she'd prepared her own defence. She had another parcel with her, said it contained something that would destroy me more effectively than any forgery charge could. He shook his head. I should have known she'd have a countermeasure. Evelyn always did. Miss Marple sat very still, pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. 2 parcels, Mr. Latham's evidence against Mrs. Wyndham, and Mrs. Wyndham's mysterious package for the auction. But Mrs. Wyndham's parcel had remained unopened, sealed and set aside for later revelation. What was in her parcel? Miss Marple asked. Did she tell you? No, but she was smiling when she mentioned it. That cruel smile she had when she knew she'd won. He looked at Miss Marple intently. The police have taken it as evidence. Inspector Slack says they'll open it as part of their investigation. But Miss Marple knew what was in that parcel. She had seen it described in the outline of events, though the knowledge had not yet emerged naturally in the investigation. A silver-framed photograph and evidence of an affair that would ruin someone's future. Mr. Latham, she said carefully, when you spoke with Mrs. Wyndham outside the hall, did anyone else see you? Several people passed by, though. I don't know if they recognised me. I've changed considerably since I last lived in London. He paused. There was one woman who seemed interested in our conversation. She was watching from a window, older lady, rather thin, kept looking out as though checking on something. Mrs. Price, Miss Marple thought, always observing, always watching. And after your conversation with Mrs. Wyndham, you came directly to the inn? Yes. I was furious, but I'm not a fool. I knew I needed to control my temper, to think carefully about my next move, so I took a room and stayed here. I was in the public room having a whisky when word came about Evelyn's death. He looked at Miss Marple steadily. I didn't kill her, but I can't pretend I'm mourning her either. Miss Marple rose, gathering her gloves. Thank you for your frankness, Mr. Latham. I believe the truth has a way of emerging. and innocent people have nothing to fear from it. I hope you're right, Miss Marple, though in my experience the truth is often less important than what people believe. As Miss Marple walked back through the snow-covered streets, she considered what she had learned. Mr. Latham had motive and opportunity, certainly, but his very openness suggested innocence. Guilty people, in her experience, rarely volunteered information about their grievances with the deceased. No, the murderer was someone else, someone who had seen Mrs. Wyndham as a more immediate threat, someone whose future hung in the balance, someone who had acted not from old hatred, but from fresh desperation. And Miss Marple thought she was beginning to understand who that someone might be. Chapter 8. The Teapot That Didn't Belong. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning in quiet contemplation, reviewing what she knew and what she suspected. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though gaps remained. After luncheon she decided that a visit to the Guild Hall might prove illuminating, particularly if she could examine the tea service without Inspector Slack's interference. Fortune favoured her in the form of the vicar's wife, whom she encountered on the high street carrying a basket of correspondence. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so glad I've run into you. Inspector Slack has finally released the hall, though he's insisted we leave everything exactly as it was for another day or two. I need to retrieve some papers from my desk, but I confess I'm rather reluctant to go in there alone. Would you possibly accompany me?" Miss Marple agreed with an alacrity that might have seemed suspicious to anyone less preoccupied than the vicar's wife. They made their way to the hall together, the vicar's wife chattering nervously about the disruption to guild activities and the cancelled Christmas auction. "Such a waste," she lamented as she unlocked the door. "All those donations. And now we'll have to postpone everything until the new year, though I suppose one mustn't think of such things when a woman has died." The hall was cold and dim, the heating having been turned off. Their breath made clouds in the frigid air as they entered. The vicar's wife hurried to her desk while Miss Marple, with studied casualness, drifted toward the back of the hall, where the tea urns and serving implements had been arranged. The teapots sat in a row on the counter, 3 large brown earthenware vessels that the guild had used for decades. Miss Marple examined them carefully, noting the chips and stains that marked years of service. But there was something odd about the middle pot. She lifted it, feeling its weight, and brought it closer to her face. A faint scent clung to the interior, something that was decidedly not tea. Miss Marple recognised it immediately. Lavender, but not the natural flower scent. This was the sharper, more chemical smell of a cleaning solution, the sort used for removing stubborn stains and sanitising surfaces. She set the pot down and considered this discovery. The guild's teapots would have been washed after their last use and stored in the cupboard. On the morning of the Christmas tea, they would have been brought out filled with water and set to boil. There should be no trace of cleaning solution remaining, not after boiling water had passed through them, unless this particular pot had been substituted for one of the regular ones, unless it had been prepared separately, brought to the hall, and placed among the others without anyone noticing the exchange. "Have you found what you need?" Miss Marple called to the vicar's wife. "Yes, just gathering the last of it. This cold is quite penetrating, isn't it? I'll be glad to leave." But Miss Marple was not yet ready to leave. She moved along the counter, examining the cups that remained from the reserve stock. 6 cups, as she had counted before, but the saucers beside them numbered 7. An extra saucer, or rather, a saucer whose cup had been removed and used for murder. She looked more closely at the saucers. They were not quite identical, she realised. 6 matched the reserve cups perfectly, showing the same maker's mark and pattern. But the 7th was slightly different, the glaze less refined, the rim less perfectly circular. It belonged to an older set, perhaps one that had been partially broken and mostly discarded. Someone had brought a cup and saucer from elsewhere, someone who needed a vessel that could be prepared with poison in advance, then introduced to the tea service at the critical moment. The lavender-scented teapot suggested the same person had also prepared a specific pot, ensuring that the poisoned cup would be placed near it, ready to be switched with Mrs. Wyndham's cup during the confusion before the toast. "Miss Marple, are you quite all right?" The vicar's wife had returned, her arms full of papers, looking concerned. Perfectly well, my dear. I was just remembering something. Miss Marple smiled. Tell me, who was responsible for washing the tea things after the last guild meeting? Why, Mrs. Larkin, as always. She's very particular about the cleaning. Uses her own supplies, in fact, because she says the ones we provide aren't strong enough. The vicar's wife paused. She's especially fond of a lavender cleaning solution. Says it leaves everything smelling fresh. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. Yes, that's very helpful. As they left the hall and parted ways, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Mrs. Larkin had access to the teapots and the opportunity to substitute one that had been specially prepared. Mrs. Larkin had been agitated about the donation box, which suggested prior knowledge of the accusatory letter it contained. And Mrs. Larkin, according to Mrs. Price, had been present in the kitchen during the crucial period before the tea began. But what was Mrs. Larkin's connection to Mrs. Wyndham? What secret could be significant enough to drive a quiet, hard-working woman to murder? Miss Marple recalled the conversation with Mrs. Bantry on the day of the tea. Mrs. Larkin's upcoming engagement to a respectable gentleman from Much Benham. Her late husband, who had died years ago, leaving her with nothing. The whispered rumours that Mrs. Price had mentioned about debts and missing money. And then Miss Marple remembered something else. The mysterious parcel that Mrs. Wyndham had brought to the tea, the one intended for the auction. Mr. Latham had mentioned that Mrs. Wyndham claimed it contained something that would destroy him. But what if that had been a bluff? What if the parcel was meant for someone else entirely? She needed to see the contents of that parcel. Inspector Slack would have taken it as evidence, but perhaps Dr. Haydock, who had been present when it was collected, might know what it contained. She found the doctor at his surgery, writing up notes in his precise, methodical hand. He looked up when she entered, his expression suggesting he had been half expecting her. Miss Marple, I wondered when you'd appear. You have questions, I suppose? Just one for the moment. Mrs. Wyndham's parcel, the one she brought for the auction. Do you know what was inside? Dr. Haydock set down his pen. Inspector Slack opened it yesterday evening, in my presence. It contained a silver-framed photograph of the guild, taken about 15 years ago, and there was a second photograph underneath, loose, not framed. Might I ask what the second photograph depicted? A summer fete, Mrs. Wyndham and a man laughing together. Rather an intimate scene, I'd say. The sort of thing that would cause talk if it became public. He paused. There was a name written on the back. Robert Larkin. Miss Marple drew in a slow breath. Robert Larkin. Mrs. Larkin's late husband. The man who had died suddenly, leaving debts and rumours in his wake. And here was evidence that he had been involved with Mrs. Wyndham. Evidence that would destroy Mrs. Larkin's hopes of remarriage if it became known. The framed photograph, Miss Marple said. You mentioned it was of the guild. Was anyone missing from it? Now that you mention it, yes. There was a tear in the photograph as though someone had been removed. Inspector Slack thought it might have been done deliberately, perhaps as some sort of threat. Mrs. Larkin, torn from the photograph, her husband's infidelity documented, her future hanging in the balance, and Mrs. Wyndham cruel and calculating, preparing to expose it all at the Christmas auction. Doctor, Miss Marple said, I think I know who killed Mrs. Wyndham, but I need to be certain before I speak to Inspector Slack. Would you be willing to accompany me to call on Mrs. Larkin? I believe a medical man's presence might be useful. Dr. Haydock studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Though I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Marple. Confronting a murderer can be dangerous business. I've found, Miss Marple said gently, that the truth is often less dangerous than continued deception, and Mrs. Larkin, I think, will be relieved to tell the truth at last. They found Mrs. Larkin at her cottage, her small, neat dwelling on the edge of the village. She answered the door with the same nervous manner she had displayed at the tea, her face going pale when she saw her visitors. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, I wasn't expecting anyone. May we come in, Mrs. Larkin? Miss Marple's tone was kind but firm. I think we need to talk about Mrs. Wyndham and about what happened 15 years ago." For a moment, Mrs. Larkin stood frozen. Then quite suddenly, her face crumpled and she began to weep. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never meant to kill anyone. But she was going to ruin everything. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd hoped for, I couldn't let her do it." Dr. Haydock moved quickly, guiding the sobbing woman to a chair. Miss Marple followed them inside, closing the door behind her. The truth was emerging at last, painful but necessary, like lancing a wound that had festered too long. "Tell us," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell us everything from the beginning. It will help, I promise you." And Mrs. Larkin, between sobs, began to speak. Chapter 9. The Gift with the Silver Ribbon. Mrs. Larkin's cottage was spare and clean, the home of someone who had learned to live with very little. A small fire burned in the grate, and the furniture, though worn, was polished to a high shine. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph in a wooden frame. A younger Mrs. Larkin with a man who must have been her husband, both smiling at the camera with the confidence of people who believe their happiness secure. Dr. Haydock had provided Mrs. Larkin with a glass of water and urged her to sit. Miss Marple took the chair opposite, her manner suggesting neither judgment nor urgency, merely patient attention. "Take your time, my dear," she said. "Begin wherever feels most natural." Mrs. Larkin clutched the glass with both hands, staring into it as though seeking answers in its depths. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Robert and I were married young. Too young, perhaps. He was handsome and charming, and I thought that was enough. But charm doesn't pay bills, and it doesn't keep a man faithful." She paused, and Miss Marple waited. The story would come in its own time, as confessions always did when one allowed space for them. We'd been married 5 years when Evelyn Wyndham came to St. Mary Mead for the summer. She was visiting friends, staying at the manor house. She was everything I wasn't. Glamorous, sophisticated, confident. Robert was dazzled by her. They barely tried to hide it. "The photograph," Miss Marple said gently. "The one at the summer fete." "Yes, someone took it. I don't know who. Robert and Evelyn laughing together, as though they hadn't a care in the world, as though I didn't exist." Mrs. Larkin's voice had taken on a bitter edge. "I found out about the affair eventually. Everyone in the village knew, of course. They always do." The pitying looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. "What did you do?" "I confronted Robert. He promised it was over, that Evelyn had gone back to London and he'd never see her again. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because what else could I do?" She set down the glass with trembling hands. 2 months later, he was dead. Heart attack, the doctor said. He was only 32. Dr. Haydock shifted in his seat but said nothing. Miss Marple kept her eyes on Mrs. Larkin's face. "After he died, I discovered the debts. Robert had been living well beyond our means, trying to impress Evelyn, I suppose. There were loans, gambling debts, money borrowed from people all over the village. I had to sell everything. The house, the furniture, even my wedding ring. I was left with nothing but the clothes I wore and the shame of being Robert Larkin's widow." "And you took the position at the guild," Miss Marple said. "Yes, cleaning, taking care of things, honest work, even if it was humble. I thought I could rebuild my life slowly, quietly, and I did over the years. I made myself useful, made myself respectable again. And then 6 months ago, I met Mr. Thornton." Her face softened for a moment at the mention of the name. "He's a good man, a widower, runs a hardware shop in Much Benham. He's kind and steady, everything Robert wasn't. When he asked me to marry him, I thought I'd been given a second chance at the life I should have had all along." "But Mrs. Wyndham returned," Miss Marple said. 3 years ago. I couldn't believe it when I heard she'd taken a cottage in the village. I thought perhaps she wouldn't remember me, wouldn't remember Robert. After all, he'd been just one of many men who'd fallen under her spell, but she remembered. Oh yes, she remembered." Mrs. Larkin's hands clenched into fists. "She saw me at the guild one day and smiled, that terrible smile of hers. Said she was so pleased to see me again, asked after my health with such false concern, and then she mentioned Robert, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. Said what a charming man he'd been, such a pity he had died so young. She was toying with you, Miss Marple observed. I tried to avoid her after that. Kept my head down, did my work, stayed out of her way. But then Mr. Thornton proposed, and I made the mistake of telling some of the ladies at the guild. I was so happy, you see. I wanted to share my good news. Miss Marple could imagine the scene, the quiet woman finally allowing herself a moment of joy, unaware that her happiness had already been noticed and marked for destruction. Evelyn heard about the engagement. Of course she did. Nothing happened in St. Mary Mead that she didn't know about. She came to me privately, a week before the Christmas tea, told me she had something very special planned for the auction, said she'd found some old photographs while sorting through her things, and she thought the guild would be fascinated to see them. The photograph of you and the other guild ladies with your image torn out, Miss Marple said, and the photograph of Robert with Mrs. Wyndham. Yes, she showed them to me, made sure I understood what she intended to do. She would present them at the auction, tell everyone about the affair, make it all public again. And she would mention the debts Robert had left, the shame I'd caused by not paying them back properly. She said Mr. Thornton should know what kind of woman he was planning to marry. Tears were streaming down Mrs. Larkin's face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. Everything would have been ruined. Mr. Thornton is a respectable man from a respectable family. If he knew about Robert's affair, about the scandal, he would never marry me. I'd be alone forever, cleaning other people's dirt, living on other people's charity. So you decided to stop her, Miss Marple said quietly. I didn't plan it. Not at first. I just kept thinking there had to be a way, some way to prevent her from destroying my life again. Mrs. Larkin looked up, her eyes pleading for understanding. I know about plants, Miss Marple. My mother taught me which ones are safe, which ones are dangerous. Foxglove grows wild behind my cottage. I'd used it before, years ago, to deal with rats in the cellar. Knew how to extract the poison, how to concentrate it. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. That's extremely dangerous knowledge, Mrs. Larkin. I know, but when you're desperate, when everything you've worked for is about to be taken away, you think of desperate things. She drew a shaky breath. I prepared the cup at home, added the foxglove extract, then crushed some holly berries on the saucer to disguise the smell and make it look like an accident, like someone had tried to use Christmas decorations without knowing they were poisonous. And the teapot? Miss Marple asked. I washed it at home with my lavender solution, so anyone examining it would think it had come from my cleaning supplies at the guild. I brought it the morning of the tea, along with the cup and saucer, while everyone was busy with decorations. No one noticed. No one ever notices the cleaner. There was terrible bitterness in those last words, the accumulated resentment of years of invisibility. I placed the poisoned cup on the back counter with the reserve china, Mrs. Larkin continued. I knew Evelyn would arrive late, as she always did. I knew she'd be seated at the head table, and I knew that during the toast, in all the confusion of everyone raising their cups, I could then make the switch. I was serving, you see, moving around the tables, adjusting things. It was easy to take her cup and replace it with the poisoned one. The cup you took from her place, Miss Marple said. The one with the chip near the handle. What did you do with it? I brought it to the kitchen and washed it immediately. Then I put it back with the others on the table. No one saw. Everyone was watching Evelyn listening to the toast. Her voice broke. And then she drank and she fell, and I realized what I'd done. I'd killed someone. I'd become a murderer. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Dr. Haydock looked grave, and Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. There's something I don't understand, Miss Marple said after a moment. The note that was found in the Tinsel, the one asking someone to meet at the old mill, did Mrs. Wyndham send that to you? Mrs. Larkin nodded miserably. It came 2 days before the tea. She said we would settle things privately after the auction, that I could beg for mercy if I wanted to. I carried it with me, kept reading it, trying to think of what I could say to change her mind. I must have dropped it during all the chaos after she collapsed. And the letter in the donation box, Miss Marple continued. The one exposing Mrs. Wyndham's fraudulent charity donations. Do you know who wrote that?" "I think it was Mrs. Price. She's very good with accounts, very precise. And she'd have mentioned once that she thought something wasn't right about Evelyn's claims of charitable giving, but I don't know for certain." Miss Marple considered this. Mrs. Price, who had observed so much and reported so carefully. Mrs. Price, who had tried to destroy Mrs. Wyndham's reputation through exposure rather than violence. Two women, each attempting to neutralize the same threat, each choosing their own weapon. "Mrs. Larkin," Dr. Haydock said gently, "you understand that I must report this to Inspector Slack." She nodded, her face resigned. "I know. I've known since the moment it happened that I'd be caught. You can't commit murder and expect to escape, not really. Part of me is relieved, actually. The waiting has been terrible." "Is there anyone I should contact?" Miss Marple asked. "Mr. Thornton, perhaps?" Fresh tears spilled down Mrs. Larkin's cheeks. "No, please don't tell him. Let him think what everyone else will think. That I was mean or desperate or whatever story they choose to believe. Let him remember me as I was before all this, not as what I've become." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered garden. She thought of all the women she had known over the years who had been pushed to desperate measures by desperate circumstances. Women like Mrs. Larkin, invisible and undervalued, carrying burdens that slowly crushed them until something finally broke. "Dr. Haydock," she said quietly, "perhaps you should telephone Inspector Slack now. Mrs. Larkin has been very brave in telling us the truth. The least we can do is ensure she's treated with dignity." As the doctor went to make the call, Miss Marple returned to her chair beside Mrs. Larkin. "I won't say I approve of what you did," she said softly. "Murder is never justified, no matter the provocation. But I understand the desperation that drove you to it. Mrs. Wyndham was a cruel woman who took pleasure in destroying others. She created the circumstances of her own death. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "it doesn't. But perhaps it explains it. And explanation, if not forgiveness, is sometimes all we can hope for in this imperfect world." Chapter 10, Tragedy and the Christmas Light. Inspector Slack arrived with a speed that suggested to Haydock's telephone call had interrupted something considerably less interesting than a murder confession. He was accompanied by Constable Polk, who looked distressed at finding Mrs. Larkin in such circumstances. She had always been kind to him, Polk reflected, always had a word of greeting when they passed in the street. The formalities were conducted with as much gentleness as Inspector Slack's nature allowed, which was to say with brusque efficiency rather than deliberate cruelty. Mrs. Larkin repeated her confession, her voice growing steadier as she progressed through the tale, as though the act of speaking the truth aloud had provided some measure of relief. When she had finished, Inspector Slack sat back and regarded her with an expression that might have been grudging respect. "Well, Mrs. Larkin, I'll say this for you. You've saved us considerable time and effort. Not many have the courage to confess outright." He paused, "though I wish you'd found that courage before resorting to murder." "So do I, Inspector," Mrs. Larkin said quietly. "More than you could possibly know." As Constable Polk escorted Mrs. Larkin to the waiting police car, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple with an expression that mingled irritation and acknowledgement. "I suppose you worked all this out before you came here?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple said. "I had suspicions, certainly. The teapot with the lavender scent, the extra saucer that didn't quite match, Mrs. Larkin's agitation about the donation box, but I needed to understand the why of it before I could be certain of the who." "And the parcel Mrs. Wyndham brought? The photographs?" "That was the key, I think. Once I learned what they contained, the motive became clear. Mrs. Wyndham intended to destroy Mrs. Larkin's future happiness, just as she had destroyed her past. Some people are like that, Inspector. They find pleasure in causing pain." Inspector Slack grunted. "Nevertheless, murder is murder. Mrs. Larkin will face trial." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. Though I suspect the court will show mercy, she acted from desperation, not malice, and there is the matter of Mrs. Wyndham's own character to consider. The fraud, you mean? The false charity donations? Among other things, I believe you'll find that Mrs. Wyndham had quite a history of manipulation and cruelty. Mr. Latham's story about the art forgery is only one example, and I suspect Mrs. Price's letter exposing the fraudulent donations would have revealed much more had Mrs. Wyndham lived to face those accusations. Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. How did you know Mrs. Price wrote that letter? Who else would have had both the knowledge and the precision to document such fraud so thoroughly? Mrs. Price was married to a doctor, accustomed to careful record-keeping, and she had access to guild finances through her position on the committee. The handwriting confirmed it naturally. Naturally, Inspector Slack said, in a tone suggesting that nothing about Miss Marple's methods was natural at all. After the police had departed with their prisoner, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village with Dr. Haydock. The afternoon was drawing toward evening, and lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows, warm glows against the gathering darkness. A sad business, Dr. Haydock observed. Mrs. Larkin will likely spend years in prison. Perhaps, though I shouldn't be surprised if the sentence is relatively lenient. There will be sympathy for her circumstances, particularly when the full extent of Mrs. Wyndham's character becomes known. Miss Marple paused. And Mr. Thornton may yet prove more understanding than she believes. Good men often are, when given the chance. You think he'll wait for her? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that genuine affection has a way of surviving revelations that seem insurmountable in the moment. But that's for them to discover. She bid the doctor farewell at her gate, and made her way inside to the warmth of her cottage. The fire had burned low, and she took a moment to build it up again, watching the flames catch and spread. Outside, the snow had begun falling once more, adding fresh layers to what already lay on the ground. Mrs. Bantry called that evening, full of news, and questioned, "Jane, the whole village is talking about nothing else." Mrs. Larkin, of all people. I would never have suspected her. She always seemed so quiet, so harmless. That, Miss Marple said, is precisely why she was able to commit murder successfully. We see what we expect to see, Dolly. A cleaner is invisible, easily overlooked. It makes for excellent camouflage. But how did you know it was hers? Miss Marple considered the question. I suppose it was the accumulation of small observations, the lavender scent on the teapot, her nervousness about the donation box, which suggested she knew what it contained and feared Mrs. Wyndham's reaction, her access to the tea service and her knowledge of plants and poisons. But more than that, it was understanding the psychology of the situation. What do you mean? Mrs. Wyndham was the sort of person who enjoyed wielding power over others. She had destroyed Mrs. Larkin's marriage, contributed to her financial ruin, and now threatened to destroy her second chance at happiness. Mrs. Larkin had been invisible and powerless for so long. The murder was an act of desperation, yes, but also an act of reclaiming power. She chose the method, the moment, the manner. For once in her life, she was in control. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. How horrible! And yet I can't help feeling some sympathy for her. Evelyn Wyndham was a dreadful woman. Yes, she was, but that doesn't justify murder, Dolly. It never does. We must have laws and consequences, or civilization crumbles. Mrs. Larkin understood that when she made her choice. She knew what would happen if she was caught. After Mrs. Bantry had departed, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, thinking about the events of the past few days. Another Christmas, another tragedy. It seemed almost inevitable that the season of peace should so often be marred by violence. Perhaps it was the enforced cheerfulness that brought out the worst in people, or perhaps it was simply that human nature remained constant regardless of the calendar. She thought of Mrs. Larkin sitting in a cell tonight, contemplating a future vastly different from the one she had imagined. She thought of Mr. Latham at the inn, finally vindicated, but finding the victory hollow in the face of continued loneliness. She thought of Mrs. Carter, who had been spared whatever revelation Mrs. Wyndham had planned for her, saved by murder from a scandal that would never now see light. And she thought of Mrs. Price, whose careful documentation of fraud had been rendered irrelevant by a more permanent solution. All of them had been touched by Mrs. Wyndham's cruelty, and all of them had responded in their own ways. Some with patience, some with confrontation, and one with poison in a teacup. The tinsel still hung in the guild hall, Miss Marple reflected, glittering in the darkness like false stars. It would be taken down eventually, stored away until next Christmas, when it would emerge again to cover the same old walls with the same bright disguise. Rather like the village itself, she thought, where secrets hid behind polite smiles and darkness lurked beneath festive cheer. But the truth had emerged this time, as it usually did when one took the trouble to observe carefully and think clearly. The cup had been in the wrong place. The teapot had betrayed its origins with the scent of lavender. The photographs had revealed old wounds that had never properly healed, and Mrs. Larkin, invisible for so long, had finally been seen. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at the silent, snow-covered street. Somewhere in the village, families were gathering for the evening meal, children were playing with Christmas toys, and life was continuing its inexorable forward march. The murder of Mrs. Wyndham would be discussed for months, perhaps years, but eventually it would fade into village history, becoming just another story to be told on winter evenings. She turned away from the window and settled back into her chair, reaching for her knitting. The pattern was complicated, requiring close attention, which was precisely what she needed. Something to occupy her hands while her mind processed and filed away the lessons of this particular tragedy. "Christmas tinsel can hide faults in poured plaster," she murmured to herself, echoing the words she would soon say to Dolly Bantry when they discussed the matter properly. "And motives in hearts, but not forever. Not forever." Because truth Miss Marple had learned through long experience had a stubbornness that matched her own. It might be buried, disguised, or delayed, but eventually it surfaced. Like spring flowers through winter snow, like blood on white linen, like poison in a teacup at a Christmas tea. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and outside the snow continued to fall on St. Mary Mead, covering everything in its cold, pure blanket. But beneath that blanket, life continued, in all its complicated, troubled glory, and Miss Marple, as always, would be watching,